on the official Marvel podcast. All your burning questions about Marvel Television's Daredevil Born Again episodes 1 and 2 will be answered by the cast and crew of the show.
In the first episode of this new iteration, to sit opposite one another and have a scene unlike any scene we've ever had before. It was so fun. It kind of felt iconic. And I just think really smart writing, really fantastic storytelling.
Plus, we'll hear about Daredevil's most unforgettable moments from the comics.
Later on, we'll hear from Echolocation Expert Lore Thaler about how humans are already using their radar sense.
I'm Anthony Carboni.
I'm Ray Lowe.
And this is the official Marvel podcast.
Okay, Anthony, I know it's only been a few days, but are you caught up on Daredevil?
Ray, I'm never caught up on my bills, but I am always caught up on Daredevil. I am dying to talk about this show.
Okay, thank God, because you know what we're doing today, Anthony? We're talking about this show.
Good.
But before we get any further, we need to sound that spoiler alarm.
Okay, listeners, you've been warned. Let's get into it. The most shocking moment of the first episode has to be when Foggy Nelson, lawyer and best friend to Matt Murdock, is killed by the assassin Bullseye.
It is insane that happened in episode 1. Fast forward 1 year, Karen Page, colleague, friend, and sometimes more than that to Matt Murdock, has left town. Bullseye gets a life sentence for killing Foggy. Matt is still practicing law, but has given up his Daredevil identity, and former crime boss Wilson Fisk has won the election for New York mayor.
Whew! In episode 2, Matt Murdock and fellow attorney Kirsten McDuffie are holding it down at their law firm, Murdock and McDuffie. Wilson and Vanessa Fisk start marriage counseling with their therapist, Heather Glenn. Fun fact, Heather happens to be the woman Matt just started dating. We also meet Hector Ayala, who rescues a guy getting roughed up on the subway by what turns out to be 2 police officers. One of those cops ends up falling onto the tracks and gets killed by an oncoming train. This is when Hector discovers he just got into it with the police, and now he's in trouble. Can Murdock and McDuffie clear his name? As we mentioned earlier, episode 1 marked a major moment in the show with the death of Foggy Nelson.
Here are Daredevil Born Again directors Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead on what it was like approaching this heavy turning point.
I remember we were talking to Eldon about it, because we only got to work with him a little bit, as for obvious reasons. And it was really interesting where he has a very personal story around it. And we're kind of like working about like how his character feels about dying and how he feels as an actor playing this character for so long, and then they die. It's the incident that makes the entire season happen, right? Because he puts away his mask and he decides he went too far. And we started realizing that the stakes were incredibly high because this person we cared about so much, and Eldon himself, who had lived with this character for so long, even though he hadn't played it for a while since then, it made us feel highly emotional.
Yeah. Usually when you're dealing with death, and I won't even just say superhero stuff, I'll just say action entertainment. Usually when you're dealing with the idea of death in action entertainment, not usually, but just say often, these are things that just happen. It's the expectation of the genre, and people mourn for a little bit. And then by the time you're done with the third act, redemption has happened. Everything's fine.
Yeah.
This is a show where the grief ripples out in a much more realistic way. Any violence that's going to happen has consequences that are much closer to real life.
Yeah, and how could you have a show that is saying this, where it's like the consequences are real, but then you never kill anyone you actually care about?
Yeah.
And it's an atom bomb on his life and on him as Daredevil. It's the whole season and beyond, by the way, of him coming to terms with what he did that night because of his friend dying.
Episode 1 also reunites Matt Murdock and Wilson Fisk after a very long time apart.
Daredevil Born Again executive producer Dario Scardapane breaks down that electric diner scene between Matt and his greatest foe.
I wanted to get them together, not fighting. It's the drink before the war. They know it's inevitable. They want it so bad. They want one of them to step out of line. It was one of those scenes that was magic to write. It was a blast. Then I got into a room with Vincent and Charlie, and it was Vincent and Charlie who were like, there needs to be some humor. And Vincent's like, well, it can't be funny. And then those guys kind of built the laugh. And the moment that, as soon as Fisk laughs, that scene changes, turns on its head, and you're in. And I'm extremely proud of that. And it's one of those collaborative efforts in the sense that on the page, it was one of those like nods to film geeks, like this is a classic scene. Then when you get the actors involved, it's something else entirely. Then you get Justin and Aaron involved, and the way they shot it was so brilliant. That two-shot, I mean, I've got a picture of it on my wall that Sana gave me at Wrap. That two-shot is just, it says it all. It was great.
So what do Vincent D'Onofrio and Charlie Cox think of the layered relationship between Fisk and Matt? Well, there's a sports analogy for that.
I think the idea that we're inseparable in a sort of awful way. I think that we sort of need each other to exist, but would rather the other didn't exist. And Charlie is like a good example with your football example.
Yeah, right. I always say it's like if you have a passionate love of a sports team, I pose the question: would you want your biggest rival, your arch nemesis, would you wish them into non-existence if you could? And I think most people would answer no. That the fabric of your identity is tied up with their existence, as it were. And I think that's probably true of Fisk and Daredevil. After three years of 3 seasons of this show, over the span of 10 years, in the first episode of this new iteration, to sit opposite one another and have a scene unlike any scene we've ever had before was just it was so fun, and it kind of felt iconic, and I just think really smart writing, really, really fantastic storytelling.
And how could any of us forget that epic fight scene in episode 2 between Matt and those crooked cops? Dario shares his thoughts on that action-packed moment. He's
letting something out. Charlie said it to me long ago. When the gun's to his head and he's saying, don't do it, he's not talking to the cops. And you feel that. And I think that one of the real, it's fun to play with, but one of the real dilemmas that the character has is Daredevil likes the violence. He does not shy away from it, and part of him likes doing it. And that's one of the quirks. That's one of the dilemmas of the character. And when we go big like that, and there's a really big scene later on too, when we go big like that, it's purposeful because we want him. There are consequences to what he does for him and for others.
Okay, we've heard from the stars of the show. Now let's dig into what started it all, the comics.
That's right. It's time to learn some history from the pages of classic Daredevil stories. I spoke with associate editor on the current Daredevil comics, Lauren Amaro. Thrilled to be joined now by Lauren Amaro, who is associate editor on Daredevil, but you are also doing so many other things in the Marvel Universe right now, yes?
Yeah, there's a couple things going on. I technically work in the Avengers corner of the Marvel Universe, but more specifically, I work with sort of the darker, grittier street level stuff with heroes like Daredevil and Moon Knight, and also sort of the spookier, more paranormal side with characters like Ghost Rider and also Werewolf by Night.
Amazing. Well, sounds like we have exactly the right person here to talk to us about 5 of these very important moments in Daredevil's history. Starting off with Stan Lee and Bill Everett. Daredevil number 1, 1964, the first appearance of Daredevil.
The very one.
So obviously this gives the entire origin of Matt Murdock. Everything that we know about Daredevil's kind of core origin is all here in issue number 1.
Yeah. It's so fun in general to go back to the first issue, first episode of anything, because you can really see just the bones of the character, see sort of what lasts the test of time, and see what sort of gets shed over time as they streamline and truly find who that character is. And I don't think that this issue is any exception to that.
Yeah, man. And my two favorite things, like visually, that I love is we get the yellow suit,
Mm-hmm.
which is such a fun suit. I think it was like only 6 issues later where we get the sort of red suit that we know. And the other thing we get is instead of his sort of like tonfas or eskrima that he usually has, he's just got a cane, like with a hooked handle as Daredevil. And I've always loved that.
I think there's something so special about it, especially because he uses it so often either to grab people, or I think it like saves his life in this first issue by like hooking around a flagpole or
Yes.
something of that nature. And we still use that to this day. Like Matt's cane like is still sort of collapsible, like folds into those batons, and he still uses them. And it's just sort of another way in which Matt's disability, his blindness, also very much the source of his superpowers, is so integral to who he is as a civilian and as a hero.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the fun thing about that is this conceit where like Matt Murdock is a lawyer and a nice boy and he made a promise to his dad, but Daredevil has not done any of those things. It's such a lawyer answer to the problem of there's a separate legal entity that will do the things I need to do, but I love that he's doing it with basically Matt's everyday cane, which is like this cool visual reminder of Matt Murdock. It's just neat. I like it.
Isn't that so, again, I think you said it well, emblematic of who Matt is as a person, in that he will follow the spirit of the law and not the letter. Like that is what
Yes.
he's so after.
Yeah, absolutely.
Our next moment is one of the most famous and recognizable runs in the history of Daredevil. This is Daredevil Born Again, number 227 to 231 from 1986.
And this is Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli.
I'll be honest, I was so excited to come onto this podcast, mainly because I've been looking for a reason to go back and reread this. I mean, it's just, there's a reason why when people talk about what Daredevil run should I read, this is one that I feel like people most often point to, because it really is great. It shows Matt Murdock being pushed to the edge, and you just see him at his lowest. Kingpin sort of strips away the entire support system that he has, and you sort of see it. David Mazzucchelli, I think, illustrates that descent for Matt really well in a series of splash pages of Matt sleeping, just with one snapshot. He really does give you a quick glimpse and tell you where Matt's mental state is and what his status quo in each of these issues are. And they're beautifully composed.
It's kind of beautiful. And the other thing that is wonderful about this run is that it really does set up so much of what we know as modern Daredevil. First of all, just the Kingpin himself. The idea of the Kingpin as this super strong, larger than life figure, this guy who's like not afraid to get his hands dirty and get into a fight. And people are like scared of him.
Absolutely. I mean, that first introduction shot that you get of Kingpin, like even in sort of all of this excess, all of this luxury, like he is very much down to business and scary, not only because he is, like you said, like inhumanly strong, like very much willing to get his hands dirty and to be the one to do the dirty work if he has to, if it comes to that. But he's also very smart and has the wealth and the means to tear your life apart without really having to lift a finger. And that is terrifying.
You know, one of the things that we're going to see going forward is how all of these runs sort of mirror what's going on in society at the time, you know, and so you get to sort of see this thing that becomes such a huge part of Daredevil, which is Daredevil is a lawyer, Daredevil is talking to people every day, the things that people are worried about connect to Daredevil.
Yes. And I think someone who actually does that really, really well in their Daredevil run sort of grounding Matt and making him sort of confront these societal issues is Ann Nesenti, who I think is sort of the next person that we wanted to talk about.
That's right. Well, we're talking about Daredevil number 254 here from 1988.
Matt has been disbarred from practicing law. He's in another personal spiral here, and he has decided, like, maybe I don't need to be Matt Murdock, or maybe I don't need to be Daredevil. And this is kind of one of those periods where Matt Murdock is like, I'm tired of doing all the stuff that Matt Murdock needs to do. It feels like Daredevil can get things done easier.
It's so interesting, too, because Anne Nesenti is just so interested in that sort of complex inner life of heroes. And she sort of teases that out here by having set up this law clinic.
Mm-hmm.
And you see her sort of bringing the people of Hell's Kitchen to Daredevil. Like, he's interacting with them in the costume. I think in this issue, like, you see Daredevil having a race with a bunch of kids on skateboards, and he's having a great time. And they're so cute.
They're goofing on Daredevil, like, and Daredevil is always just goofing right back. Like, they are not afraid of Daredevil at all.
No.
And they just want to be his friend.
But it's so good, and it's so important, too, because it shows Daredevil being part of that neighborhood, being part of that community, which, you know, he's so strongly tied to Hell's Kitchen, and Anne really shows you why. And I think it's also, again, it shows how well Ann Nesenti can really sort of weave the story that we care so much about this. We were sort of talking around the big moment of this issue is that it's the introduction of Typhoid Mary, one of my favorite villains. We're so caught up in talking about, like, what's going on with the people of Hell's Kitchen. Like, there are so many people that I just fell in love with at a glance, or, like, you know, because she makes you care about them. But this issue is the introduction of one of Daredevil's wildest villains. Go out and read this issue. If you're not already a fan of hers, I promise you will be by the end of it.
It really is a wonderful one. As is our next one, which is from 2017. It's Daredevil 595 to 600. This is Mayor Fisk, baby.
Yes, it is. This is also, fun fact for you, I joined Marvel in 2018, and one of the first series that I ever assisted on was this run of Daredevil. So Mayor Fisk was sort of the status quo when I started.
That's so cool, because this is such a wild run, and it introduces so many, like, interesting characters and interesting themes. Wilson Fisk is now the mayor and is extremely anti-vigilante for reasons that he is justifying to the public, but obviously privately, he's the kingpin of crime, and these heroes are getting in his way.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked a little bit earlier about how Matt is very much the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law. But what do you do when the law becomes corrupt? And sort of the way that Fisk is, the way he's instituting new policy, or, you know, even twisting sort of loopholes in the law to get the things that he wants. And Matt has to deal with all this because he was popularly elected. He's very much the rightful mayor of New York. And you even see sort of Matt make a deal with the devil, to be cute about it, by accepting a position in Fisk's office. So it's an interesting position to put Daredevil in and to see him wrestle with.
A lot goes down in 5 issues. I'll say this, and we have not mentioned, of course, Muse. Muse is in this, and I love Muse as a villain. I truly do.
Muse is fantastic and also horrific. Muse is a serial killer artist who is leaving these works of art across town to sort of provoke Fisk, provoke Daredevil, and also sort of leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. Muse, I agree with you. I think he's one of my favorite villains to come out in recent years. There's something about even just like his design that just immediately sort of captures your attention.
That brings us to sort of our final moment, and this is one of my personal all-time favorites here.
This is Daredevil number 20 from 2019, writer Chip Zdarsky and artist Marco Cacchetto, The Battle for Hell's Kitchen.
This is a couple of billionaires. They're real estate investors, and they simply want to own Hell's Kitchen. The end. And they're going to do it.
There's so many great moments in this issue. There's one great panel where Fisk and Daredevil are fighting back to back.
Yes.
And I got to that page in my reread and I had to pause right there just because I'm like, man, that's a shot. Like, that is so good.
Just the stark difference in size between
Yes.
Wilson and Matt.
Wilson Fisk should always be as big as a house. It's great.
Yes. I've always wanted the Kingpin to be somewhere in between Hulk and like Thanos. I just feel like I want Wilson Fisk to be 8'7" and 700 pounds.
Well, he certainly feels larger than life, and I think Chip does such a great job of having his presence be felt in the series.
Yeah, and this is, of course, Fisk is mayor. There has been a little bit, because of certain events, there's been a little bit of loosening up on vigilantes, but we're still anti-vigilante. And what's going on is these billionaires were not able to buy out Hell's Kitchen, and so they have sent in every villain they can hire to level it so they can buy it for pennies on the dollar.
It's the Owl leading them, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
Who was introduced, I want to say, in it's either issue 2 or 3 of Daredevil.
Yeah, really early on.
Really early on. And again, I think that's sort of another one of Chip's strengths in that you can tell that he knows Marvel history because he plays with it so well and he brings it in ways that not only sort of nod at that history, but also offers some new twist to it. I think one of the best case in points is he brings back Typhoid Mary,
Yes.
and has her and Fisk in a love story that I am fully invested in. I'm actively rooting for. They're two kind of awful people, but when I see them together, it almost doesn't matter to me. I want them to be happy. I want them to go off into the sunset. I would just prefer, if it wasn't over Matt's dead body, but, he also does such a great job of sort of giving everyone their own sort of character development and growth. Another example of that is the fact that we get Elektra becoming Daredevil in this run.
Mm-hmm.
Seeing her step up and be in that suit, and also starting to see sort of where her and Matt, what they agree on and where their ideologies differ and what that means for them.
Because this really ends in an interesting place because, Daredevil is kind of surreptitiously working with a police detective who knows that helping out Daredevil right now is the right thing to do. But obviously, once everybody, particularly Ben Urich, figures out what's going on in Hell's Kitchen,
Mm-hmm.
the news crews are there. Everybody's there. Everybody sees Daredevil and the Kingpin. Everybody sees the people of Hell's Kitchen dressed up as Daredevil fighting together, and they go, "Oh, this is probably bad." And this ends with a very huge status quo change for Daredevil, which is he agrees to just be arrested.
Yeah. Seeing Matt allowing himself to be arrested, again, is one of those things where Matt believes in the law and he respects it. Again, sort of the spirit of the law more than the letter, but he has such a strong sense of justice that he himself is also beholden to that. So there's something really interesting about him sort of submitting himself to that. He doesn't run, he sort of accepts it and is sort of will let things play out. But obviously there's sort of a lot of stake there, and he has his own sort of personal wants and desires, and obviously being arrested is not conducive to those.
Yeah. Oh, so there you go. 5 must-read Daredevil moments. Thank you so much, Lauren.
All right, thank you guys.
The real-world term for Daredevil's radar sense is echolocation, which makes us wonder, what are humans actually capable of when it comes to heightened senses?
Here's fellow host of the official Marvel podcast, Victoria Ying, speaking with Durham University's Laura Thaler about her research on echolocation. Victoria, take it away.
Laura, it's great to have you here. Can you introduce yourself to the listeners and tell them what you do?
I'm a professor at Durham University in the United Kingdom, and I do research. In my research, I work on sensory neuroplasticity, so how the brain changes when changes arise in sensory input. For example, when you learn a new skill or when you lose a sense, like vision, for example.
Interesting. I have so many more questions. So your research investigates how echolocation works and the ways it may benefit people with visual impairments. What exactly is echolocation?
Echolocation is, many people probably have heard about it, like from bats, maybe from marine mammals. And in people, it works in exactly the same way. So you make a sound, the sound goes out into the environment. And then if you imagine yourself in a perfectly empty space, like in a big desert, essentially the sound would travel on forever. But as soon as you bring in an object that's hard and then reflects the sound bounces off of that object and then returns back to the person, and they can then use this information, this sound echo, to interpret what's around them. And so in people, echolocation works, in this way. And people often ask, well, which sort of sounds do people use to echolocate? And so what we found is that many people who use echolocation on a very regular basis, they use mouth clicks, like this, very brief clicks. We have found that these mouth clicks do work very well and that they provide a lot of detail, good resolution, and also that they work really well in situations where other sounds are present.
That is fascinating. How could you imagine it being useful for people with visual impairments?
So if you don't have vision because, say, you're blind or visually impaired, say if you have, just very limited vision, or say if you're in a dark environment, so then you don't have access to the visual information that many people really take for granted. And so there are many tools or, many techniques that can give you information about things that you can, for example, touch. You can also use your hearing, your other senses to perceive the environment. Now, the advantage with echolocation is that the sound can travel really far. So in the lab, people have shown that echolocation works at distances of 32 meters. That's the furthest distance tested. We have been out with people in the field, walking around, testing how they can echolocate. And we've also made detailed measurements of clicks and reflections, so how sensitive are people to perceiving echoes. And so theoretically, echolocation can work also at further distances, like 50 meters. If you have a really, really large target, maybe even look at 100 meters. It just gives you a lot more information about your environment that you wouldn't otherwise have, because when you make your own sound, to explore your environment, you are in control. You don't have to rely on the environment to make the sound for you.
Wow, it's incredible to hear how self-reliant humans can be. So you co-led a study in 2021 showing that both blind and sighted people can learn echolocation with just 10 weeks of training. What kind of exercises went into the training? What kind of improvements did you observe?
So this was the paradigm that we introduced in 2021, and we had 4 tasks that we asked people to do. And these tasks were inspired by previous work that we did, but also by having, read other people's work, and then also just basically spending time with echolocators. So there were 3 tasks that were lab-based. 2 of them involved people making their own clicks. And they had to click at objects and, for example, tell us the orientation of an elongated board. And this could be oriented, vertically, horizontally, or with its right side up or left side up. And then we would ask people to make clicks and then tell us, which orientation it had. So they started at a very close distance, like a distance so close that they could, in principle, touch it. But so they started at like 33 centimeters. And then when they were at about 90% correct, they had to go further away to 66. So we always sort of doubled the distance. And we had people, for example, who could do this task after their 10 weeks of training. They could be like 3-4 meters away from this object. Another task that we used was people making their clicks, and then they were presented with 2 little discs, and they had to say if the bigger disc was above the smaller one or if it was like below the smaller one. So it's like you have to imagine you have to click and then you use the echoes to determine the size of an object, but at the same time you also have to locate it. It's like a combined, size and localization task. And again, people started fairly close. And then after 10 weeks, we had some people who were, about 4 meters away. Some people were maybe at 2 meters. Everyone was out of reach. Like, the object was well far away from them. So they wouldn't have been able to touch it at that point. A third task we used was a computer-based echo-acoustic navigation task. So you can imagine yourself wearing headphones, and then we had a keyboard, and they could use arrow keys to go forwards, backwards, to turn. And then they were basically walking through a set of corridors, and the only information they got were the clicks and echoes of the corridors that they were walking through. And then they had to find the exit out of this corridor, which was made from a different material. And again, it sounds a bit abstract, but people picked this up really quickly.
This is such a fascinating study. Okay, we're talking about echolocation, so I have to ask you a Daredevil question. So in the comics, after Matt Murdock, aka Daredevil, went blind after an accident, his hearing, smell, taste, and touch were amplified to superhuman degrees. He also developed a radar sense that formed a mental picture of his surroundings. In real life, according to your research, what is a human being capable of when it comes to heightened senses?
In my research, what I find is that people keep surprising me at how quickly they can pick things up. I mean, our main paradigm is echolocation, so that's where I come from. And then we ask people to do tasks like, navigate a virtual environment or walk through a room blindfolded or, in the absence of any vision and if people are blind. And they just pick up things like echolocation so quickly. And also like being attuned to the rest of the environment. So when you navigate without vision, you still have to build a map of the space that you're moving through because, say, if you want to turn around and walk back to where you came from, if you have your vision, that's sort of easy because you have a landmark, you can just go towards that. But if you don't have access to that, you have to still achieve this goal in a different way. And what fascinates me is that, people are able to do it.
Thank you so much. Your research sounds fascinating, and thank you again for taking the time to speak to us and tell us all about echolocation.
Thank you.
Let's turn our attention to another awe-inspiring superhero whose adventures have spanned comics, animation, movies, and audio. On this day in 2018, Marvel's Wolverine: The Long Night fiction podcast released its first 2 episodes. It was written by Benjamin Percy and featured the voices of Richard Armitage, Bob Balaban, Zoe Chow, and more. The show was so successful that it inspired a Spanish-language version called Wolverine: La Larga Noche, and a comic book adaptation. It was named one of the best podcasts of 2018 by Apple and also won the 2019 iHeartRadio Award for Best Scripted Podcast. The series focuses on 2 special agents who investigate a series of murders in a remote town in Alaska. Their prime suspect, Logan the Wolverine. As our heroes dig into the mystery and begin uncovering the secrets of this small town, the evidence does seem to point towards Wolverine as we hear in this clip from episode 1.
Let's go with Sammy's throat. Drops him, and he just charges across the deck. That's it. He's gone.
He's gone? What do you mean he's gone?
I mean, he's gone, man. Saw it myself. He just up and jumped off the side of the boat. I figured he was dead, right? That's suicide. Until I saw him a couple weeks later at the Dirty Shame, drinking in a corner booth.
Huh.
Nearly pissed myself. Left my beer on the counter, ran right the hell out of there. Look, I'm telling you, man, this guy is a psycho. People are getting cut to pieces. He's to blame. All I had to do was take one look at him, and I knew. He's a killer.
What was his name?
Logan. His name was Logan.
Wolverine: The Long Night is available wherever you get your podcasts.
Next week on the official Marvel podcast, we'll hear from Daredevil Born Again stunt coordinator Philip Silvera on what makes Daredevil's fighting style so unique.
Yeah, it was a great return to the past and being able to be part of that evolution for Daredevil Born Again.
That's it for this episode. If you haven't already, make sure to leave us a review wherever you're listening. It helps other Marvel fans to find the show.
Yes, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode.
This episode was hosted by Anthony Carboni and myself, Raylo.
Our producers are Jasmine Estrada and Anita Flores.
With help from Senior Manager of Audio Production and Development, Brad Barton, and Production Manager, Emily Godfrey.
Mixed by Zachary Goldberg.
Theme music by Ida Akbal.
Executive producers are Larissa Rosen and Jesse Berger.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.